I remember interviewing a researcher who said, "Oh, you can talk to kindergartners about porn." And I was like, "How?" And she said, "Well, you just say, you talk about naked bodies and you say, some adults like looking at naked bodies. They think they're really interesting and attractive. But, we know just like it's not great for you to drink coffee because it's not great for your brain. We know for kids, it's not great for kids to be looking at videos and pictures of naked bodies because it can just be confusing. And so if you ever see that, talk to me." So like there are ways of talking about this where you don't have to get into like all the details, right?
Hello and welcome back to the show. I am so excited about today's guest, Melinda Wenner Moyer. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Melinda is a writer, a speaker, and she is the author of How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. She is I'm a major fangirl of hers. She writes a lot about things that are relevant to me and the way I'm trying to raise our kids here. So I'm super excited to have her on because she was someone that I've been reading a lot about and following her advice. And I know so many of you are in a similar season of motherhood as me. And so I'm hoping you gain a lot from wherever you are in motherhood, that you can just gain a lot from this conversation. So Melinda, welcome to the show.
Hi, Katie. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, I know I share with you a little bit offline, but that I have got 4 kiddos, but 2 of them are in these teenage years that feel really like, it's funny. Everyone says like, you're so busy in the beginning when the kids are younger. We don't really realize how much you have to be on mentally as the kids get older and how it just like changes. And I feel, I don't know if you feel this way with a 13-year-old now, but it's almost like you have to be, I don't want to say more cognizant of your parenting, but they just need you in different ways. And so my biggest thing right now is just trying to raise these teens to become really good people out in the world. And so when I saw your book, I was like, yes, this speaks to me. Can you share a little bit about, for those who don't know you, about your background and what prompted you to write, first of all, a parenting book, and then second of all, a parenting book around how not to be assholes?
Yes, absolutely. So I'm a science journalist by training. And for many years, I was writing about like hard science stuff like genetics and neuroscience. I still do sometimes. And then I had kids and I had so many questions, just, constant questions. And every time I would try to look up an answer, I felt like it conflicted. Like I would get 4 different answers online or from friends or relatives, and I didn't know what to believe. And so I wondered if science might help me. Like maybe there were answers to my parenting questions in the research on child development and parenting. And so I started digging in and I found there's so much research and very little of it is actually covered and, translated to a lay audience. And so I started writing a column for Slate that was all basically me answering my own parenting questions. And then eventually my kids got older and the kinds of questions that I had changed. And there was, this was back in 2018. And I kind of felt like there was just so much bad behavior everywhere. Like everybody was being,
there is now. Yes.
Right. Like, and I really worried about, are my kids observing this? Like, I felt like it became like more acceptable for people to say like outright racist and sexist things. And I was like, are my kids seeing this? Are they learning that it's okay to do this? Like, what can I do as a parent to raise kids who grow up to be good humans who don't do this basically? And that was, like it became a really like existential, like crisis for me as a parent. Like, oh my God, this is the most important thing. I want my kids to be good people. How do I do that? That was the inspiration for my book. Like, I was like, I'm going to look into the science and see, like, is there science on how to raise good human beings? And there's a ton of it. And so that's what I did. And I wrote all about it.
Well, and I think what's so interesting is because your book, it almost, in many ways, I don't want to say contradicts some of the things that we think about with parenting. That feels like innate, and I know I felt in this camp in the very beginning when my kids were little of like wanting to shelter them from some of these bigger topics or some of these harder things. And then you end up raising kids who don't know how to discuss some of these harder topics or don't feel shame around some of these issues. But it's exactly what you said. It's like, but they're seeing it out in the world anyway. And I'm seeing so much of that right now, especially like with everything going on, not to even discuss our political system, but with the elections coming up and things are getting heated and people are saying things and our kids are witnessing things. And so if, as our parents, if we aren't, I'm sure you feel the same way, sort of guiding them and having a space at home where we can talk about these things and not making it feel shameful or right or wrong, just a space for them to learn, to observe, to ask questions, to get some guidance. They're going to be doing it out in the world anyway. But it is one of those things, like when I was raised, it was very like taboo maybe to talk about some of the things, to talk about politics or to talk about money or to talk about, racism. Like, I don't think we would have ever said even like the word black, or like, it would have been like, oh my gosh, don't say that, and
Yep.
it's, I'm really having to be cognizant now to unlearn some of those things and start over as a parent. So all to say, your book is very refreshing because I think it gives parents permission to talk about the things that they in their gut, I believe intuitively, like, I want to be having these conversations with my children. I just don't know how. And just kind of raising a light about like how important it really is, because at the end of the day, all we want are, to raise good people who are going to leave the nest and go off and do good in this world. I don't
Yeah.
know. So thank you. It's such a refreshing read.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. And I just have to say that I'm also like unlearning a lot of ideas I had about what it is to be a parent, because my family, we didn't talk about sex, we didn't talk about race, we didn't talk about any of these things when I was growing up. And so I just want to acknowledge that it can feel hard, and that's okay. Like, it can feel like I don't know how to do this. I'm terrified I'm going to make a mistake, and screw up my kid if I use the wrong language or whatever it is. And I mean, those fears are real. Especially if you're a white parent and you're trying to talk about race, like, we have been socialized to never, ever talk about it. Right. So it is hard. And I just want to acknowledge that reality.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that too. And I think it's really important. And we'll get into, I already told Melinda earlier, I'm like, I really want to talk about racism with our kids. I want to talk about sex. I want to talk about sexism, all these things. So we'll get into it. But I appreciate you acknowledging that, because I do feel like it's one of those things, like, because it can feel scary, and especially in this time of, like, I don't want to say cancel culture, but there is this fear of, if I get it wrong, if I say the wrong thing, I don't want to be pointed out. I don't want to be shamed. And it is sort of one of those things. And I've said this a lot, with my own kids, like, I'm going to get a lot of this wrong. And I, especially for you or myself, or put yourself out there in spaces publicly, that I'm getting a lot of it wrong publicly too. And that can feel really scary, but also it's sort of necessary. It's sort of like, that's sort of the job, is like to continue to do it. So speaking of, can we dive right in to some of these like bigger questions and like bigger topics? Okay, so the first one for me personally, it's on the forefront of my mind, is, this sexism and talking about the differences in genders and stereotypes. I have my third son is sort of gender nonconforming, I guess you would say. You would say, I don't know why. And I try not to share too much of his story, because as a young kid, like, he's still learning and figuring out who he is, and he'll share his story whenever he's ready or that time comes. But having him as a child, I witnessed behaviors that didn't fall in the stereotypes that my other two children, gender-wise, really fell into the traditional stereotypes. And so it really created a new awareness in me as a parent to be more cognizant of language, of just the way we handle things in our home, the way we talk about so many different things. And I just wanted to know if you could speak upon this a little bit, because it sort of is one of those like personal things in my heart. Can you share a little bit about, for parents, just how we can be more cognizant around sexism or traditional gender roles in our homes?
Yeah, I guess, I want to start by just pointing out like how strongly kids are interpreting gender stereotypes around them, like how powerful they are, because I think sometimes we're immersed in this culture, we have been our whole lives. It can be hard to sort of see how powerful they can be. But gender is an especially powerful category for kids, like social category. And if you think about it, like we are constantly communicating the importance of gender when we talk about other people. I mean, we're referring to everybody either like by their gender, like, oh, that woman, this man, or those boys, those girls. And we're, and every pronoun we use is referencing a person's gender. And, you go to a toy store and it's like different aisles for boys versus girls and clothes and bathrooms. I mean, in every possible way, our kids are being bombarded with this message that gender is really, really important to our culture. And that unfortunately is not very good, because when kids get that message, like, okay, gender is really important, they then start to figure out, well, okay, if gender is important, it must mean that the two genders. And of course, I also just want to, acknowledge that I'm oversimplifying here, because gender is not as binary as I am going to, imply that it is. But, they're getting this message that like, the two genders are different in very, very fundamental ways. And they're trying to figure out, well, how are they different and why are they different? And when they start doing this, they also start noticing that men tend to have more power in society than women do. And they notice these like behavioral differences too. And they start thinking like, okay, maybe there are these really big differences between the genders that I need to understand and pay attention to. And I need to like conform to whatever behavior is acceptable for my gender in order to sort of fit in. And then they also make these really worrisome interpretations looking at like the gender hierarchy. And they're like, well, if men have more money and more power than women do, they try to figure out why. And a lot of times the answer they get and they give themselves is, well, maybe like men are smarter or inherently more powerful or worthy of power. So there's all these things that stem from just this simple observation that, okay, there are two genders and clearly the genders are important. And they make all of these interpretations that are really not great, right? And ultimately sexist.
Yeah.
So sorry, that was a long preamble. And I haven't even.
It was perfect.
But you want to know, like, what can we do as parents, right? Like,
yeah. And I know in your book, you shared so much about like one of them is like being more cognizant around language, which is so hard to do. And I still have to catch myself. And I've been really aware of this since Sloan was a young child. And I still catch myself when we're talking with the kids, even saying things like, do you have a crush on anyone? And not being like, do you have a crush on a girl? Or like, and that's a silly example, but really like opening it up. And we've gone as far as John Paul and I will try to not say, husband and wife, will be like my partner, and making things, and granted, now it's a little bit different than just talking about gender here. I'm talking about something a little bit different, but it is something that even if you are really aware, is just, you don't notice how many times like throughout the day, she, he, boy, girl, it's everywhere. And so, yes, I would love to hear any advice that you have for parents on this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a few things. As you said, the language part is hard, but to the degree that we cannot use gendered labels, like if we can say, oh, like, look at those kids playing soccer instead of look at those girls playing soccer, to the degree that we can like underemphasize, or reduce our emphasis on gender, that can help. Again, very hard to do. Another is just really kind of checking our own assumptions about what our kids are going to enjoy or what they're going to like playing with based on their gender. And I think, that can be as simple as really trying to tune into, when it's their birthday, like instead of buying, if you have a daughter, like all, dolls, like gender stereotypical stuff, like kind of pushing against that. And I was lucky, I was raising my daughter after I raised my son, and we had all these trucks and, trains and all this sort of gender stereotypical boy stuff. Also, some less gendered stuff, but she was like so into that. But whenever it was her birthday, everybody would buy her like really girly stuff, right? Like all of my relatives and stuff. Yeah. So I think, if we can think outside the box in terms of the types of toys we buy, maybe the types of colors that we put our kids in, that's a tricky one. But, just not trying to center everything around what we expect they're going to like to wear or like to play with or like to do based on their gender. Yeah. That can be helpful. And then, the other big thing is to actually talk about sexism with our kids and find ways. And this, when I say that, I don't mean like sitting down and having some like hour-long, lecture on your child about like, let me tell you about sexism. Um, but instead thinking of and observing things that happen in your life or their life where it can be an opening for even like a 1 minute or 2 minute conversation about gender. And it, honestly, like once you start paying attention, you notice that there are opportunities all over the place. It's like you're watching a TV show and with your kid, and like the boys say to the girl like, oh, you can't do that, you're not strong enough or something, and you can pause and say, that was interesting, what do you think, why do you think those boys said that to that girl, do you think that's true, or girl's not strong, like why do it's like everywhere once you start tuning in. And then just you can start with a question. Like, this is another thing that people think, like, how do I start this conversation about sexism? It honestly, you can start with like, that was interesting. Did you hear that? Or what did you think of that? Or what does that make you think about? And, letting them sort of start the conversation, and then you kind of see where they are and what they observed, if anything. And then you can kind of pipe in. But a lot of times starting with questions is like the best, I mean, really on any topic, the best way, like to sort of check in with where they are. And yeah, just using these like little moments throughout your day, their day, to talk about sexism, to talk about gender stereotypes. Like, God, I remember picking my son up from camp once, and the counselor said, oh, it's so nice. Like, all the boys are always so loud. Every boy is so loud, and your boy isn't, or something. And I got into the car later with him, and I was like, that was an interesting observation. Do you think all boys are loud?
Yeah.
We talked about how that's like an idea people have about boys that maybe isn't accurate, right? So it's little things like that, but they can make a really big difference in terms of like illustrating to our kids that it's more complex than what some people, what the world sometimes tells us, that gender is not this binary, predetermined thing that affects behavior and interests and whatnot, that it's much more fluid than that.
I love that so much. It's such good advice. And I really think going back to like checking our own biases and like being cognizant of that, and even how we sort of maneuver in our own home life, and the things that we kind of model really speaks volumes as well. It's funny, not funny, but we're sort of going through a transition in our home right now. My partner has been the primary breadwinner, and I've been home with the kids, and that is shifting and changing. And over the past 2 years, we've had a lot of conversations about what equitable parenting looks like, regardless of income levels, and things like just dividing up work. Even like the mental workload that I used to carry alone, like shifting more of it onto my partner, who is the primary, bread income winner, like a primary income bringer, I guess you would say. I don't know how you say that. And it is interesting how my children, like, it's really affected our home. And I think it's been actually really good because it sort of fosters some new conversations around, yes, dad is now the primary person responsible for, he's taking you to the dentist, and he's doing these things that mom used to do because mom's pushing really hard. And like, I know, but mom, you're not making any money. And I'm like, well, I know that, but that's not about women's value is different. And so really understanding sort of how, when we unconsciously set up our home and some of the dynamics and the marriage and within our partnership and our family, we were saying, this is what a woman does, and this is her value, and this is what a man does, and this is his value. And I don't think John Paul and I, when we were first married, we were having those types of conversations about like, how are we going to model fair or like equitable parenting? It wasn't conscious. And it really has become something over the past few years that has been more on our radar. And I'm so grateful for it. And we are not getting it right, but it has been really interesting to see, even for as aware, but I think our home is, like, my kids will still have moments of pushback and be like, wait, you're doing this, not mom. And I'm like, wait, you guys, are we still there? But I get it. And it's funny because even as a woman, like, I'll still find myself having moments of like mom guilt over things, and I'm having to catch my own old stories around what a woman should be. And so I recognize, like, if I'm still carrying this, I know it's still then reflected in our home, and my daughter is picking up on these nuances, and my son's picking up on these nuances. And he did something recently. I can't remember what it was. We were on a vacation. And he noted something, and I said to him, he just noticed something. We were going hiking, and he like noticed something about a trail, and I was like, "Thank you so much for noticing that." And I took a second to comment to him. I said, sometimes it can be looked at that like men or, don't pick up on some of these nuances or these little things. And it's a woman who has to always be thinking 10 steps ahead. I said, so I really appreciate that in the family dynamic as a man in this home, that you're noticing, you're paying attention, you're thinking ahead for us and planning for us. And it's really sweet. It's just interesting how like I'm trying to be more cognizant of it. Anyway,
Yeah.
just more my personal take on it.
No, I think that's great. I mean, there's a lot of value in acknowledging and praising boys for like emotional, having emotional literacy, like being emotionally observant and expressive. There's definitely that's very, very helpful. And just to speak to your other point about like domestic inequality.
Yes.
There's some really interesting research showing that kids really do notice that inequality in the home if the mom is doing a lot more domestic labor. I always sometimes feel hesitant sharing research that like might make parents feel like, oh my gosh, oh no. But I will give a potential way to address it in a second. But we know that girls and boys notice this in the home, and that when girls are growing up in a home in which mom is doing most of the labor, they actually say that they have less interest in having a career, and they start doing more around the home too. And I noticed this with my kids, where my daughter does so much more. She's so much more helpful. Like she's like, I'll clean the table. I'll help me make dinner. And my son is like, no, I'm going to go sit in my room, And so I've interviewed some of these researchers, and I'm like, well, what do we do? Because sometimes this isn't in our control. If you're a woman and you're doing a lot of the labor, it's not as easy as just asking sometimes your husband to do more. Sometimes it doesn't work out. And I wish it were different, but they said, honestly, then if you can't change it, then just talk about it, acknowledge it with your kids, and, don't like throw your partner under a bus, but say like, here's why it is this way in our home. Like, we wish it were more equitable, but here's what we're doing. Here are some ways in which we are trying to make it more equitable, and just really having those conversations so that it's not just this silent thing that kids are observing and making inferences from, but you're actually talking about, about the issue and why it's complicated, why it is the way it is. That can make a huge difference.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. I kind of had a feeling, I'm like, I think they're picking up on this. So I love that the research is supporting that. And I love that really it comes down to is to continue to have these conversations. It's continue just to point it out and to state the obvious, to say, yes, mom is doing a little more. And until things change, physically for us, here's how I'm feeling about it. How do you feel about it? How would you like to set up your partnership moving forward? These were not conversations I had growing up. I didn't even know there was such a thing as like equitable parenting. I didn't even know I was allowed to ask my partner to change diapers. Like I didn't know that was a thing. And so, I'm hoping our sons and our daughters go into, just learn a little bit more from our experience, and having those conversation things is so helpful. So thank you. That was great. Switching gears a teeny bit to talk about something maybe a little bit more sensitive, but I think is equally, if not more, not I don't say more important, but just as important, talking to our kids about race. And, I will just share really quickly, when everything happened in 2020 with George Floyd and the BLM movement, like really picked up, my partner and I were pretty cognizant of like, okay, we need to make some changes in our own home. And we took the kids to a few protests, and we were reading as many books with them as we can. And we did all the things that we thought, to be as proactive as we could to raise children who were aware of race and understanding like the systems of oppression. And about a year ago, a situation happened with my daughter at school where she said something that was really shocking to me as a parent. I was like, wait a second, gosh. And it's not my story to tell of hers. And it was really disheartening for me as a parent. I had to separate my own emotions from her experience. And of course we talked it through, and she made repairs that she needed to make, and she's worked on it, and it was a really good learning lesson for her. But all to say, I think it's one of those things like that was, 4 or 5 years ago that we were starting to become more cognizant and aware of how important it is to talk about some of these systems of oppression in our home and make sure our kids were more cognizant. And then to see, a few years later, my daughter make make a comment that was shocked me, really sort of rocked me as a parent. And so I'm really excited to talk about this because I think it's something, especially for white parents, since we do carry so much privilege, it falls on our shoulders to be cognizant of it and to not be so afraid of it and to just really get in there. And I'd love to so I share that just to open up the conversation of like, I've been trying and we're still not there in our home.
Well, I appreciate your courage in sharing that. And I mean, my children have also said things and done things. My daughter was participated in a study during COVID where it was like an online study. And in the study, the researchers they were showing pictures of different kids with different skin colors and saying, who would you like to play with out of all these kids? And who would your parents like you to play with? And every time they asked, who would your parents like you to play with? She picked a white kid. And I was like, oh my God, like she thinks that I don't want her to play with non-white kids. And that was another moment where I was like, there's a lot more work to do. So I think it's important to keep in mind that the world in which we live is sending a lot of very racist messages to our kids. So when they make these comments, I mean, in a way it is an opportunity for us to realize what work we need to do. So they can be good moments in that sense. And it's unfortunately, it's not a failure of yours because they are getting, and I'll explain a little bit about how they're getting these messages, but they really are what they're seeing in the world is, causing them to sometimes make inferences that are really, really unfortunate and racist and biased. It is really important for us to talk about it. But I also I don't want parents to think that, oh my gosh, if my kid said something racist, it means that I taught them something racist necessarily. But it does mean that we need to actively combat the messages that they are kind of getting. So just to briefly kind of explain, why do kids become racist? It's a little like what I was saying with gender, where kids are constantly, one of their most important jobs is to look at the world around them and try to make sense of it, right? And we are social creatures. So they are looking at like what groups of people have what amounts of power and status in the world. And they're paying very, very close attention to this.
Yep.
And they notice that with race, there's a very big, power differential, where white people in our society tend to have more money, more prestige, more power, more everything than people of color. And if we don't give them the explanation that they need, which is, well, racism is why white people have so much more power and everything, they try to figure it out themselves. And as you can imagine, the simplest explanation is, well, maybe white people are smarter, better, more powerful, whatever it is, right? And we know that it's really interesting. There's research showing that kids and adults really kind of tend towards these inherent explanations for inequalities, where they think like it's got to be something about the individual, like something that makes them better or worse. They really don't think structurally and think about like society. And it makes sense because the structural stuff is more complicated, right? Like kids are not going to be like, maybe, so they tend to make these interpretations based on what they see that are racist, right? Like, oh, maybe Black and brown people just aren't as smart, don't work as hard, et cetera, et cetera. And this is why from a very young age, we need to be correcting that, right? We need to make sure that they are understanding that these power differences are not the result of like, differences in intellect or differences in worth or anything like that, but rather a reflection of the many ways in which racism is baked into our society. So yes, and that means talking about race. And it's hard. It is hard, especially if you're a white parent. Parents of kids of color are often, they have to talk about race for many important reasons. And for white parents, it can feel optional. And also sometimes we may think, well, it's bad. Maybe there's this idea among especially white parents that avoiding the topic might be better, right? That like, well, if I don't talk about race, maybe my kids won't grow up to be racist. But that is not what the research shows, that kids notice race from the time they're babies, and they really are trying to understand the power differences. And then they make these racist interpretations unless we correct that.
Yes, yes, yes. No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important. You said just reading through your book, and it was really eye-opening for me. You talked about like, as much as we think as white parents that we are talking about it, we aren't talking about it enough. And we aren't being as just direct and like, sharing head on, like, actually, this is what's happening and this is the system. And as my kids have gotten older, I've become more like pressed harder on some of these things. And um, not in any way saying that like I think I'm doing a good job, but just so like, it is something you like have to be actively pursuing, because it isn't something that we can be like, oh, they've read this book, how not to be an anti-racist for kids, and like they're set, check, I did my thing. It's something we're constantly talking about. We went to Zion. This is a little bit different, but more about indigenous cultures. We were in Zion this weekend, and one of my kids was reading about the history of it, like this, I don't remember, like this peak. And he commented about how this settler had named it, whatever the name was. And I was like, well, do you think that was the original name? And then my daughter's like, no, because there were people in this land before them. And I was like, okay, well, then our work now, when we get home, we need to find out like what indigenous tribe like lived here. And what is the original name of this peak? Because we know it wasn't named in, 19, whatever it was. It had a name before that time period. A little bit different, not necessarily talking about Black versus white, but the same idea of like marginalized groups, and understanding as our privilege as, their privilege of being a white, and me too as a white parent, and having this privilege to be cognizant all of these different ways, moment by moment, like when I can bring it up. And it can feel like, am I really bringing it up? And, my son kind of rolled his eyes like, oh God, we're talking about it again now, even on our family vacation in Zion. I'm like, yeah, that's our responsibility. Like that is the price you have to pay as being, someone who has privilege. Like you're lucky that not saying that he's complaining, but it is sort of one of those things, like it can be for our kids. They're like, oh gosh, here goes mom again. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm so glad. I'd rather be that mom who's like, let them not necessarily roll their eyes, but you almost have to call it out all the time, because I think there is so much. And if we don't, they become a little bit more numb to it and unaware. So thank you for, sort of sharing like what the research tells us, that like if we aren't conscious of it, consciously calling it out, that our kids will keep these biases, and they will develop these prejudices. And it's something that, as parents now, like it is sort of our responsibility, not sort of, it is our responsibility to be more proactive and not just assume like they read a book and our work is done, because it's not that simple.
Often I find that there are holes in whatever they think they understand. Like in kindergarten, my daughter came home from like this whole like MLK lesson that was, I think, several days long. And she didn't know that he was Black. And because she had been taught that, Martin Luther King Jr. was all about like teaching that everybody is, that differences don't matter. Like it was like differences, and they never talked about race. And so she actually drew a picture of him with white skin. And I was like, do you not know that he's Black and that this is actually all about race? And she's like, no, nobody told me that. And I mean, my son has recently, not that long ago, he's 13 now. He was telling me about something he learned in school about Native Americans. And he said, it's so sad that they were all killed and there's no more Native Americans. And I was like, is that what? Wow. Like, yes, there are. And also racism still exists. They are still fighting. And he just sort of thought like they were gone and the problem was over. And I think that's another thing that sometimes we're taught that, so the civil rights movement fixed everything and now there's no racism. And we have to talk about how that's not true. It's certainly things have improved, but there's a lot of work left to do too. So I think like there's just so many ways in which they can, even when they have been taught to some degree, like there's holes in it, or people have not been really explicit in ways that they need, we have to fill in those holes and blanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I just really appreciate the way you talk about it in the book, and give some references for even some other books, for you to read and to share with your kids. And it is one of those things like, you know, I, again, like just looking at the world that we're living in right now, the context of like this exact moment in time and watching some of these things play out in national stage too of, just like comments being made about different races and classes and genders. And it is a really important time to be calling out some of these things, just going back to the original like premise of your book of like just being aware of it and discussing it so that just the sheer fact of like, can we raise people who are trying to be a little bit kinder, a little bit more considerate, a little bit more aware? I talk about see this a lot with the kids. I was like, it's okay that you didn't know. Like it's not your fault that we didn't know the name of that peak on our hike. Like that's not your fault, but it is our responsibility to continue to have these conversations. And I
Yes.
know in your mind, it's kind of a bummer, but like, we're going to change that. And, bringing some of these things to light. It's like, cause you don't want to walk around like so unaware and just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just the way the world is like currently right now with how people are saying things. So, just feels like the world is a little bit more numb
Yes.
to some of the
Yeah.
shocking things that people say. I'm like, just please don't be numb. Just please be aware. Like, even if it means that you're annoyed or whatever, just have a feeling about it, do something about it. Let's talk about it. Let's continue to bring it to light and just be more
Absolutely.
aware of it. So thank you for that. It's an ongoing conversation. So all this to say, just to encourage whoever's, to you listening and just it is our responsibility. Not necessarily we're going to solve this in our generation. Our kids' generation may not solve it either, but it is our responsibility to continue to have these conversations. So thank
Yeah.
you. Can we change the topics to something else? Like another big one.
Yes. Let's
Just
do
keep
it.
them coming.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was sharing with this morning with John Paul as he was unloading dishwasher. I just like to keep it really light in the mornings. And I was like, did you know that the average age that teens are having sex is 17? And he's like, I can't discuss this right now. And I'm like, no, but our oldest is going to be 16 here in 2 months. And I don't even think and I know, listen, I know it's an average, but it's not even, I don't think on his radar. I shouldn't say that. I don't know if it is. We have conversations about sex, and he's not in a relationship or anything, but I do think just it really was a little bit eye opening for me as a parent. I think of these kids, and especially my daughter who's almost 14, they still seem like babies to me. So the idea of them having sex, I'm like, oh my God. But
Yeah.
doing that and being like, oh my God, that's not real is not helping the situation and not setting either one of us up for success. So we've had conversations about, we've had sex conversations around like, we're really clear about, we talk about, menstrual cycles and we talk about actually like what's sex is like the whole thing. And my husband probably a little bit more than I do with my son, but it was a really good wake up call of being like, oh shoot, I need to be having more of these conversations and I need to be checking in more than I am. And on so many levels. So let's jump into the sex talk stuff.
Great.
Any
Yes.
thoughts or advice for parents with teens in this age who like may or may not know if their kids are thinking about becoming sexually active, if they are, if they have like hints or seeing things, like give us some tips or a piece of wisdom.
I mean, the first thing that I'll say is that, and I know you asked specifically for teens, but it's really never too young to talk to kids
Okay.
about sex and pornography. I think a lot of parents think, oh, I should keep waiting until, they're older and they're not ready for this. But we know from the research that, having these conversations early actually protects kids. It actually reduces the chance that they will have sex, and especially unprotected sex. It doesn't make them more likely to have sex.
Okay.
And so it is really important. And it can be, I know it seems terrifying, but sometimes you can just be really simple about it. I remember interviewing a researcher who said, oh, you can talk to kindergartners about porn. And I was like, how? And she said, well, you just say, you talk about naked bodies and you say, some adults like looking at naked bodies. They think they're really interesting and attractive. And But we know, just like it's not great for you to drink coffee because it's not great for your brain, we know for kids, it's not great for kids to be looking at videos and pictures of naked bodies because it can just be confusing. And so if you ever see that, talk to me. So like there are ways of talking about this where you don't have to get into like all the details, right? With teens, it's hard, right? I think again, like I try to use what's going on in the world or what we encounter to have to bring up like, hey, so I heard this, that there was something that happened at school. Like, what do you think about that? And often this can open a conversation about whatever it is. My son recently, a couple of years ago, gave me a really good opportunity because we were watching a basketball game and the announcer said something about like the score is 69-2 and he started giggling and I was like, oh, are you laughing at 69? And he was like, yeah. And I'm like, well, do you actually know what that is? I know that like all your friends probably giggle about that number, but like, do you really know what it means? And he was like, actually, no. And I was like, do you want to know? And he was like, yeah. And then we had this whole conversation about, oral sex and all this stuff. So sometimes like they make little jokes or just anything really you can use as an in, like, hey, do you have any questions about that? Or, why do you think that's funny? Whatever it is, using those kind of daily opportunities to bring it up. And I know another tip that I love that came actually from the psychologist Lisa D'Amour, whose book, The Emotional Lives of Teenagers, by the way, I highly recommend.
Oh, okay.
It's wonderful. And she talks about like, sometimes with teenagers, instead of asking your kids directly, like what they might be considering when it comes to sex and relationships or what they're doing, to ask like, hey, what's the word on the street about, this, what are your friends at all talking about like having sex? And so it doesn't feel like you're grilling them, but usually the answer they give you is kind of a proxy for whatever, they're thinking about or they're considering. And so just like, it just takes a little bit of the pressure off. And then I love car conversations. Actually, I had like a extended conversation about all sorts of things related to sex with my kids about a year ago when we were driving. And I don't remember exactly. I think we were listening to the radio and somebody brought up something related to, I don't know what it was, like condoms or oral sex. And then I just said like, hey, do you know what that is? Do you have any questions? And then they like kept peppering me with more. And it was like this long conversation. And I think car rides are great because kids don't have to look you in the eye. And they don't have anything better to do in the car. So they're like, okay, let's talk about this. So that's another thing that I've had many sex related conversations with my kids in the car, and it's worked really well.
I love that so much. I really love the one too about just like asking, like, what's the word on the street? Like, I always try to do like, so what's going on? Like, who has a boyfriend? Who has a girlfriend? And my kids will get annoyed. I'm like, Mom, like, back off. But I do think it kind of gives you a gauge as a parent. I'm like, well, how are you feeling about this? Like, would that feel uncomfortable for you? And I think one of the things that you said too, this really struck me when I was reading your book about this idea of like, and I'm going to butcher the language, but like not necessarily undermining their love, if you will, like their first relationships. Like we can think kind of like poo-poo it a little bit to be like, oh, it's a crush, but that they actually, their feelings are very real and very valid, and you can take the relationship seriously. And so just like you can take it seriously about their need then for a physical, like wanting to have that physical connection, like it's a real thing. And I think sometimes as me as a mom, I've had to catch my own uncomfortableness that then I'm bringing into the conversation instead of it looking like this is a real relation. My son's just starting to have feelings for, is in starting beginnings of a relationship. He'd be so mortified with me right now if I said this. So I want to tread lightly to respect his space. And he's not anywhere near having intercourse yet. But I also want to be cognizant as a mom to not minimize that relationship, that like when it comes to a point that he does, that's also a decision that he's going to make. And I have to take my feelings out of it and understand that he has agency over his body, and trust that we've had the conversations of, consent, and this is what pleasure should be, and this is why you do these things, and the whole thing, and taking like morality sort of out of it and allowing him, to have agency over his life. And that's really hard as a mom, to take yourself out of the equation of some of these things. I mean, with all of parenting, it's hard to take yourself out of the equation. But I also, staying on the topic of sex, but I think that was really important. And I do a better job as a mom talking about just sex in general with the kids. But then you were talking about this idea of giving our daughters permission to have desires. And I don't know that I'm as cognizant of that about sharing with Lillian, like I know it's already on her radar that could be like an object of desire, that like that's how she will be looked, and that boys or teens, whatever, may look at her that way. But the fact that like she also is allowed to have desires, and I know that like we know that like of course she's allowed to, but I think subconsciously as women, especially I knew I was raised like being a woman who was like overtly sexy or like wanting to be sexual would have been seen as like slutty or shameful. Like that wasn't something that we did. And so kind of just making sure that she feels like she can have permission to like also have desires, which is hard for me to think about as she's turning 14, that like she's going to. But I think that now is the time to start having those conversations, to be like, when you do that, like it's about what feels good for you too. Not just two, but like you're allowed to have certain needs and desires, and you're allowed to have curiosity about things. And it's not shameful. It's not something like that you're just an object of desire, but you're allowed to actually desire. I don't know. It feels different talking to a girl than a boy. It just feels different. And I again don't mean to gender it.
I know. It's tricky. I completely agree though. And the fact is we are socialized differently by gender, and that has implications, and we kind of need to push against that. So we do have to think about the gender stereotypes, even though we don't, we wish they didn't exist. We wish it wasn't an issue, but yes. And I think too with girls, if you're like, I don't know how to have a explicit conversation about desire, like centering, my daughter's centering her desire, I think you can also kind of weave that into a broader conversation about what the sacrifices that girls and women often make for relationships for other people. I remember recently, like my daughter was upset about something that like my son was always watching. They have screen time at the same time, and he was always taking the TV and she was using her iPad, and she was kind of afraid to say to him, I want to switch off. I want to be able to get the TV sometimes. And she was taking, she just sacrificed her desires for, for her older brother. And we had this whole long conversation about, this is something that actually a lot of girls struggle with, because, we are kind of, as women and girls, sometimes socialized to really do what other people want, and to be easy going and to give in. And I think in that kind of conversation, you can say, and this is true, like if you have a boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever, you might feel like their desire and their pleasure is more important. And it's really important that you also center your own. And I think you can have it as like part of a broader conversation too. Because these are bigger, they're symptoms of a bigger problem too,
Yes. Thank you for saying that. That's exactly what it is. It really is this idea of like just calling to light for, our daughters, like you are being raised in a good girl environment.
Yeah.
And you have to be to know that that's sort of what's happening. And so you're going to feel like guilt around some of these things. You're going to feel guilt around like, well, he wants to watch that TV show, so I'm going to let him, like, cause you're trained to be good and sweet and nice. And that's the qualities of a good girl. And that's bullshit. And we know that. And it's okay if you don't have to, you're still an amazing, wonderful person, even if you don't, give into someone else's desires, and you're allowed to have stand on your own 2 feet. But I think you're so right. It's like framing it in the context of a bigger story than just about their sexual desires. That was really helpful. So thank you. I mean, I would want to talk about like the whole sex thing all day, because I will say it's one of the most pressing things on my mind, that I'm like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to these kids? But I also think, it's funny too, going back to like one of the things that you wrote in your book, where this idea of like for parents, like not worrying and just having compassion for themselves. And so I'm trying as a mom at this stage of these kids getting older, of just having a lot of empathy and compassion for them and for myself as a mom, and just knowing like we're doing the best we can, not to like go into any of this with fear, like worry, and just know that they're going to turn out to be good people. And like, I have the best of intentions, and trusting that they're good people, and we're going to figure this out together, and we're going to navigate this. Yeah. Any thoughts on like, if you could give any parents listening right now, raising their kids at this age, I know that's a big question, like what's your biggest parenting advice? But you had said something, in your book about more compassion and more connection. But I'm just curious, like now, 'cause I know that was a few years ago you wrote that, but any piece of advice, just general advice you would give to parents right now?
Yeah. I think one of the big take homes from that book was like just lean into tough conversations, which we've talked about already in
Yeah.
this conversation. But if you're on the fence about like whether to talk about something, generally it's better to talk about, to try to
Yeah.
talk about it, and lead with a question so you don't have to go in with like some scary statement that you don't know how to make. I also just really want to emphasize that like mistakes are part of parenting and they're actually really good for kids. And especially when we're thinking about talking about things like race and how hard that is, like we're going to mess up. Like we're going to say something and realize like maybe that wasn't the best way to say that, or maybe I didn't use the right language, and that's okay. Like it is so valuable for kids when we either openly acknowledge that we don't know the answer to something. That really models like intellectual humility and curiosity, and the fact that it's okay not to have to know everything, that we're all works in progress, we're all learning, we're all growing, and we learn from our mistakes. So like modeling uncertainty, and also saying like, what, I think I kind of described that a little wrong because it's really complicated, and then I went back, I did some research, and now I think I want to talk about it a little differently with you. Like that is, I mean, all like, what are you doing in that conversation? You're showing your kids like the value of admitting your mistakes, of like taking the time to really reflect on things. So making mistakes can be really, really good. And of course, like taking responsibility for your mistakes, apologizing, it's so powerful for kids to see that. So I also just want to say, like, the goal is not to be perfect parents. We're never going to be perfect parents. And we can use kind of almost any sort of quote unquote mistake as an opportunity to teach our kids, values and to help them learn skills. So I just want to emphasize that, I would say.
I really appreciate you saying that, because I do think, and I think it's why I found your both Substacks. If you're not following Melinda on Substack, I'll link it in the show notes, for her Substack is so good. And why I love the book so much, because I do think there is so much, especially just like, and I don't want to use the word noise, but for lack of a better word, noise on social media around parenting advice and so many books. And it can really feel like, oh my gosh, if you're not following this like gentle parenting, like you're going to mess up. And it can almost create a little bit of fear in parents. And it's funny when, Asher and Lillian, my two oldest, were younger. I parented so differently. I did the like 1, 2, 3 timeout or something. I don't remember what it was, but maybe it was 1, 2, 3 magic or something. I can't remember what it was, but totally different parenting. I didn't know, like, that we didn't have the access to information that we have now. And they're turning out just fine. But I do say all the time to them of like, I've never raised a 15-year-old before. I'm new at this. And I know you've never been 15 before. And so like, we're just gonna do the best we can. And, for me, I think one of the biggest things when it's come to parenting and motherhood is to take my ego out of the equation with a lot of things, especially with the teens and these years of them exploring themselves and coming into their own and trying to like get it right, like how I react in certain moments. I've had lots of practice with both Asher and Lillian when they're having their moments of whether it's rebelliousness or like, figuring out their identity and the whole thing, and having to, as a mom, like not take it personally or not react and not feel like I need to always be right. And I wrote Lillian a letter for her 13th birthday. And I don't know why I'm sharing this, but I wrote her this letter. We were on a plane and I wrote it on my computer, and it was her birthday, and I scooted it over to her. And the letter was just saying like, I know I'm going to lose you in the next couple of years, because like your life is going to change and your world is going to change. Your hormones are going to change. And I just want you to know that like, you don't need permission from me or validate. Like, you're wonderful no matter what. And I know you're going to slam doors, and I know you're going to go through these things, and it's all normal and I hate the word normal, but it's all to be expected, and it's all okay. And I'm not going anywhere. So like, and I would just say to her, I've said to her a couple times over, like, it's okay. And she'll get like really mad at me. I'm like, I am not afraid of your pricklies. I'm not going to go anywhere. I'm here for the long haul. And that's been the biggest like gift that I've given myself as a mother, to just not be so afraid of them and not be so afraid to get it wrong and not take it all so personally. And just as soon as I can take myself out of the equation, everything feels so much easier. But that's really hard to do day in and day out.
It is. But you also did a very beautiful thing there, which is so simple, but so powerful for kids, which is just communicating your unconditional love, right? Like, I will love you no matter what. And, it's not a message that we often think to give our kids because we kind of assume they know that, but it can be so powerful to just say it and say, like, no matter what you do, no matter what you don't do, I will always love you. And that is, it's such an important and powerful message for our kids. So,
especially at this day and age when they're just getting bombarded with like, they're doing this wrong and they're doing that wrong. And I think our teens get such bad raps, of like, they're so this and they're on TikTok and they're this. And I'm like, actually, I think they're really good kids.
Yeah.
So thank you for saying that. I think if anything, they just need a little bit of a reminder that they're doing awesome. And we are too, as cheesy as it sounds.
Yes,
can we talk about your next book, which I'll link it in the show notes, but Melinda's next book is coming out in May 2025. Did I get that right?
Yes.
And it's Hello, Cruel World, Science-Based Strategies for Raising Terrific Kids in Terrifying Times, because we are in terrifying times.
Right.
So can we talk about where this came from, how the writing process, share all of it. Tell us the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. So, on my Substack, my newsletter, I have many, many parents who we have a lot of conversations, a lot of discussions about what is everyone thinking about right now? What's everyone worried about? And a couple of years ago, I felt like I was constantly getting comments from parents that were like, I'm so terrified on behalf of my kids. Like, we're raising them in this world that is so complicated and messy and difficult. And how do we equip them? How do we help them, cope with what they're going to encounter? And how do we help them maybe, give them the skills to even address some of these issues that they're going to face? What can we do as parents? And I just felt like there was so much helplessness and fear. And I really wanted to write a book that could help ease some of that fear and, give parents a toolbox that would help them, raise kids who can really navigate this very complicated world. And so the book is broken down into 10 skills, I guess I would say. And so, there's, I'm not gonna be able to list them all off the top of my head, but self-compassion, how do we nurture self-compassion, resilience, and with each of the chapters, I get into how does this skill develop? And then what can we as parents and other adults in their lives do to help foster it? Right.
Yeah.
And why is it so important is another one. So we have, self-compassion, resilience, financial literacy, media literacy, relationship building, how do kids struggle with relationships? That's the one that actually there's some gender differences there that are really important. And how do we help them nurture relationship building skills? There's a chapter on addiction, how do we raise kids who do not abuse substances? What do we know about that? Empathy is another chapter. There's also a chapter on helping kids achieve balance, embracing rest and leisure. Why is this so important? What can we do? Because there's just so much pressure on them now from everywhere.
I feel like we need that as parents, that chapter.
Right. I know. Right. And then I have a whole chapter on technology and just social media and what do we do? How do we help our kids develop the skills to deal with technology and social media? So I've learned so much. It was a lot of research.
Yeah.
Thousands of studies, and I did hundreds of interviews, but it was really wonderful for me too as a parent, because I'm so worried. Part of it is I'm again answering the questions I have through science and what can I do as a parent to help? So I felt like it was a really empowering experience, and I really hope that the book is empowering for parents where they feel okay, now I have a toolbox of things. And the amazing thing about it was that I was worried that there would be 8 billion different strategies I would need to talk about to cover all these skills. And there actually are a lot of, there's a lot of common things, the researchers who study financial literacy and how it develops, they don't talk to the people who study, empathy, but a lot of the things they said to me were actually very, very similar in terms of how we can help build these skills. So that was really reassuring too. It's okay, there's actually some simple stuff we can do as parents that will help build multiple skills. Comes out in May, and I'm very excited.
Oh, well, early congratulations. That's such a huge undertaking. So I just applaud you. And just for all the parents out there who feel like we're raising kids in terrifying times, thank you for writing it for us. I cannot wait to get my hands on it. I wish it was coming out sooner than May.
Well, you can pre-order it now. I think you said you did.
Yes, I did pre-order. Yes, everyone go pre-order it now for all of our sake. But I love some of those topics, especially around like social media, financial literacy, the idea of rest. It's such a thing as these kids are like watching us parents like run around with like chickens with their heads cut off. Like some tools for us as parents will be really helpful. So I am super excited to get my hands on it.
Thank you.
Before you go, share with everyone like where they can find you. I mean, I will link your Substack, but do you share it weekly on Substack?
Multiple times a week, actually.
Multiple times. Okay.
Yep. So I would say, my Substack is My Kid the Asshole is the name, although I
good.
Well, thank you. I may be renaming it in the near future, but
okay.
I know.
I'll still love it.
Thank you. I know people have mixed feelings. And also my website is melindawennermoyer.com.
Great.
So that's another way you can see what I'm up to.
Okay, great. And we will link it all in the show notes. Melinda, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for helping us parents like not feel so paralyzed and fearful around some of these topics that feel really overwhelming. And thank you for just making it approachable for all of us. I think it's really helpful. And for the times we are living in, thank you for helping us just raise people who are good humans. For all the parents, thank you for doing that work. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.